Hi folks, this is Taviasobi, and today I'm going to give my thoughts on Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak after playing the game for 200 hours. Yeah, this is actually an updated version of my first review, which I posted as an article at the Reno Gazette Journal newspaper that I work for right after the game came out. And that one was based on 150 hours. So we've had 50 more hours ever since. Have my thoughts changed at all? Well, actually my thoughts have pretty much stayed the same. Although I do have some extra perspective that I'd like to add. So I figured I haven't done my video review yet for the YouTubes. So I thought now might be a good time to do it. Yeah, so almost 15 years ago. My gosh, that's like a whole teenager right there. Yeah, back then I played my first Monster Hunter game, which is Monster Hunter Freedom Unite on the PSP. Anybody remember the PSP? That was actually a great little system. Anyway, fast forward to 2022, and here I am again, playing yet another game in the series, Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Yeah, I guess the more things change, the more they truly stay the same. Now, with more than 200 hours spent in the game, and that does not include the hundreds of hours I spent on base Rise, 400 plus, which is probably one of the lower hour counts I've had in the series. And that's not necessarily because I did not like the game, but it's just I'm at a point in my life where I'm just like super busy. It's kind of hard to squeeze in all these hours. Anyway, with more than 200 hours spent in the game, it amazes me just how much time I've sunk and continue to sink on this series. I mean, even as I've gotten older and have less free time to spend on video games in general, I always somehow find the time for Monster Hunter. You know, the same way you always find time for your significant other. Anyway, I was there back when Monster Hunter was just a niche series that didn't have much mainstream appeal outside of Japan, except for a dedicated core group of enthusiasts. And here I still am, with the series garnering mass worldwide appeal with the success of Monster Hunter World. A big reason is that the franchise just keeps giving me a reason to come back. I mean, that's pretty much it. There's just something about Monster Hunter, whether it be the gameplay, the monsters, or everything else in between, that just clicks and resonates with me. Or at least makes the synapses in my brain fire. At the same time, being a longtime player also means that I also notice a lot of things. And that's not just about what's new and improved about the latest games, but what might be missing as well. This was apparent in Monster Hunter Rise, which boasted excellent gameplay and really great monster design, but also released with an incomplete campaign and an endgame that felt a bit uneven. Despite that, I still decided to give the game the benefit of the doubt, largely due to the staffing challenges posed by a historic pandemic and the promise of free title updates. Well, that and the fact that the Monster Hunter team has always gone the extra mile in putting out a painstakingly polished product prior to Rise. And it's not that Rise was bad, it just felt a bit sparse, but gameplay-wise it was really good, at least in my opinion. Now the Monster Hunter team gets its mulligan with the Sunbreak expansion and the arrival of Master Rank monsters. Or G-Rank for you old school players out there. Of course, the question now is, does Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, well, rise to the occasion? Now, fresh off from your success in finishing off the monster rampage from Rise, Kamura's newly won peace is jolted once again with the arrival of a new wolf-like monster from beyond its shores. The invading Lunagaron, however, also brings with it a new and reliable ally. This would be Argosy Captain Rondine's older sister, Fiorane, who's apparently the vice leader of the kingdom's Royal Knight Order. Now, with Kamura's longtime ally in trouble, your hunter gets shipped off, literally, to the night base of Elgato to help deal with a new monster threat. By the way, I must say that after playing Rise on the Switch, moving to the PC, which had a simultaneous launch with Nintendo's console this time around, was a marked difference visually. I mean, I had to deal with some driver issues at first, which kind of sidelined me for a couple of days, but once that was fixed via a pre-release patch from Capcom, it's been smooth sailing ever since, and I'm using an all AMD system, by the way, which apparently was the root of my troubles. Anyway, don't get me wrong, Sunbreak looks really good for a Switch game, but the PC version, however, is a different beast altogether, especially when played on an ultra-wide display. And I'm not a PC elitist by any means. It does actually make me wish that the game had cross-saves between the Switch and the PC, which is one of my gripes. Let's get that out of the way now. Because I pretty much had to redo the base Rise campaign all over again. Which was pretty tough, because I just wanted to get to the Sunbreak stuff at that point. And so even after rushing through the original campaign, it still took me like 40 hours to get to Sunbreak. And then rushing meant I also started the expansion without my collection of decorations and weapons from hundreds and hundreds of hours played on the Switch. Plus, you know, as someone whose main group also plays on the Switch, because not everybody has a PC that can run Sunbreak, it really would have been nice to be able to continue my progress through both systems. And I say that too because I actually had hope for a while, after cross-saves were included in a list of questions from an official Capcom survey for the game. But alas, that was not meant to be. which meant I had to duplicate the same effort on 2 versions of the game, especially since early review copies for Sunbreak were limited to PC, which is why I was playing on PC. Otherwise, I would have just continued my save file on the Switch. And that's despite having a computer that can actually run Sunbreak on high settings. Anyway, in the end, all that effort was ultimately worth it. And I say that because the buttery frame rate and quick input response are just some of the benefits I got from the PC version. Not only is the game more aesthetically pleasing overall, but it also makes a big difference gameplay-wise in terms of move timing. For example, some of the weapons I use heavily are Greatsword and Heavy Bowgun, and there was a noticeable difference in terms of how often I could actually pull off my guard points and counters accurately. So I noticed that with the PC version, I was just doing things more consistently. And then there's the visual fidelity, of course, which further spotlights the stars of Sunbreak show, which is its monsters. I mean, that looks so good. Just so crisp and so vivid. I mean, World still has an advantage in terms of the environment, which kind of makes sense, right? Because this version had to be tailored to the Switch. But the monsters themselves look really good. Good enough to touch. That kind of sounds wrong, so we're gonna move on. Yeah, so little touches like monster scales and hair strands are suddenly more noticeable, and this is pretty much a reflection of the painstaking work that artists pour into every individual creature. And like I said, the environments, while not as detailed as World and Iceborne, also got a facelift overall. Now, I especially like the new jungle map, which is a kicked up and reimagined version of a classic Monster Hunter stage, and this is now my favorite location in the whole game, bar none. I mean, in addition to the nostalgia factor for longtime hunters such as myself, the new map also just has this nice flow to its design that makes exploring it a treat. And that's in comparison to the other new location, the Citadel. Ugh, the Citadel, that map. It's just so hard to go through the whole thing. And that's even with the fast travel points unlocked. And I say that because that map is quite big, but it really feels a bit unwieldy to go through. And so every time I have to hunt there, I'm just like, oh no, here we go. Especially if you need to get all the perma buffers, because you're fighting like a really strong monster. I mean, it'll take like, what, a couple of minutes, but it's still not as fast as, say, the jungle, which I really like. Did I say that I really like the jungle stage? Yeah, and then in Sunbreak, the game's endemic life also comes alive in the new maps, providing an extra advantage for resourceful hunters who know how to use them. For example, you can use a marionette spider to slam a monster into walls now, and then if you slam it on a wall that has starburst bugs, the monster just crashes down to the ground, while also getting afflicted with the bug's specific elemental blight. And then bait a monster next to a wall with slicer crabs, and they'll get pelted with sharp cutting projectiles that get even more nasty if a monster is knocked down. I mean, it's just like rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Kind of feel sorry for him when it happens. Yeah, crabs can be dangerous. In fact, it reminds me of a t-shirt I saw once that said, "I got crabs from Fisherman's Wharf." Yeah, I know. Sometimes, mentally, I'm just like a 12-year-old. Yeah, and then if you attract a monster to the shores of the jungle's northern beach area, they can actually take damage from a school of spear squid that circle around its shallow waters. I'm like, yeah, come here, and then just according to Keikaku. In fact, I've seen those spear squid actually stun a monster that's trying to leave, and then we ended up just taking it down. Press F for the poor giant Hermitor. And I really like all this stuff because it really builds on the environmental interactions that we saw in World and Iceborne. And so it makes the ecosystem feel like a part of the game. And by that I mean like a living, breathing part of Sunbreak. Little details such as these also show the typical attention to detail from the staff that I've always loved about the series. Even things like the heartwarming expression that your Kohoot owl gives you when you pet it, to quest girl Princess Chiche's adorable tendency to check to her left and right for danger, Sunbreak is just filled with all these seemingly little things that bring its world to life. In fact, I have volumes of Monster Hunter books from Japan that show just how the monsters are designed, including biological traits that they've taken from real-world animals. And these are like individually illustrated during the design process. Like, hands, feet, their little suckers, all that stuff. And so the research that goes into each creature is just mind-blowing. In fact, just check out the video I did way back on the making of Kulu-Yaku, and that's just for one monster, so I was actually going to do several of those videos, but it took a lot more time than I thought it was, and so I just did that, and I think Raging Brachydios, who still gives my niece PTSD. Even though in our last hunt, with some randoms, she was the only one who did not cart. And we finished it. We finished it because of feline insurance back in Iceborne. So 1 death each for her 3 companions, and she was the only one who did not die. Yeah, so the fact that so much attention is given to little details that most players will likely just gloss over or miss just shows the kind of dedication, love, and care from the staff that I have always liked. Even in their interviews and when they're asked about monsters, you can just like, oh my gosh, they thought about all of that stuff. And then further adding to the overall experience is the game's audio, which continues to do a great job in setting the mood. For example, when you're just gathering or moving through an area, the orchestral music recedes to the background, while the environmental sound effects from things like crickets and birds or even falling rain are just played up to immerse yourself in what is around you. And then once you meet a monster, the dramatic music comes to life, and then it makes it feel like an epic encounter. I mean, you just expect the winged hussars to just start riding down the mountainside. And then I also tip off my cap to the localization team, who did a really bang-up job with the translation of the game's dialogue. I mean, I can't remember how many times I caught myself chuckling over things like Princess Peach's inner monologue fantasies, or that cat NPC at the Elgato outpost asking me something like, "You're not letting your cats go feral, are you?" No, I'm not. I think they're not going feral. Let me check. And then you got creative quest names like Oh My Gosh Harag and Moonlit Espinascapade. And if any of you guys ever read my old guides, back when, it was still the pre-world days, and I would translate the key quests that you need to do from the Japanese version of the game. Since the game wasn't out in English yet, I just made translations of the quest names, and I would do the same thing. Just dad jokes and puns everywhere. So I can totally relate. Ultimately, however, Monster Hunter is all about one thing, which is monsters. Well, monsters and armor are actually among its weaponry of diverse elements. Actually, now that I mention weaponry, it should be monsters, armor, and weapons. Okay, monsters, armor, weapons, and gameplay is what Monster Hunter is all about. I'm not sure why, but I'm thinking of the Spanish Inquisition all of a sudden. Now, as someone who has been playing Monster Hunter since Freedom Unite, the new monsters from Rise were among my favorites in the series from a design perspective. I just love the creativity behind them, whether it be the kung fu stylings of Agnesom, or the Olympic-worthy gymnastic moves of Bishatin. It's a theme that continues with the Sunbreak expansion. While Rise had a theme inspired by the Hyakiyako, or Night Parade of 100 Demons from Japanese folklore, Sunbreak adopts a more Western touch. This is apparent not just with Elgato's Royal Knight Order, but the design of its three lords, Lunagaron, Garangome, and Malzeno, who are obviously inspired by werewolves, Frankenstein, and Dracula. I mean, I still remember when the light bulb came up on my head, and I'm like, oh man, these are totally werewolves, Frankenstein, and Dracula. Because I wasn't paying attention. Just popped up in my mind while I was doing the review. It's just so obvious, but I can't believe I missed it. Anyway, each is quite fun to fight and makes a worthy addition to the Monster Hunter Rogues list. Lunagaron is a speedy canine who starts out standing on all fours before bulking up and standing on 2 feet following his werewolf transformation. And then Garangome is just a bruising powerhouse who enlarges his fists by powerful elemental arms when he's enraged, and then loves to use high impact attacks. Malzeno, meanwhile, boasts a flashy moveset that includes an awesome teleport move, as well as a new status called Blood Blight, which triggers a life-based tug-of-war between the monster and a hunter's health. It's basically like a Castlevania boss, which I really like. There's also a returning cast of old monsters, including some fan favorites who are coming back for the first time in a while. And then, as with past games, there are secret post-game monsters to unlock at higher master rank levels, including up to level 100. Now, monsters overall feel more quick and nimble, with even seemingly slow and lumbering ones excelling at tracking you down and being right in your face before you know it. They're like big guided missiles sometimes. I'll be like, oh yeah, I'll be safe here, and like, oh, he's right on top of me. This is likely in response to all the quality of life improvements that were introduced in World that made controlling hunters easier, and then that in turn made dealing with monsters easier overall as well. Hunters are even more quick and nimble in Rise and Sunbreak, thanks to the addition of wirebug moves. I mean, just the wirefall move is like a big help as far as mobility. Now, while I love the new and returning monsters in Sunbreak, one issue I do have is the monster count. I mean, if you look at Iceborne, I believe that launched with 27 new monsters. And then in contrast, Sunbreak only has like 17 new monsters. That's a huge reduction, I think. Especially since I was under the impression that maybe they weren't doing as much updates for Rise, so they could fill up the Sunbreak monster count even more. And so this was below my expectations as far as the monster count. And then on top of that, even the monster unlocks at master rank 50, 70, and 100, while being great monsters, also didn't feel like a big surprise. And I'm not talking about the decision to spoil every monster through trailers even before the game came out. I mean, usually I like to avoid trailers, but since I was covering the game, including the previews, I had to watch them, and they pretty much showed every monster except for the last boss. So maybe that was a factor, but when I did see the monster unlocks for high master rank, I just didn't get a sense of, oh wow, I didn't expect that monster. Granted, every monster looks awesome and feels great to fight, so the quality is there for sure. It's just that the quantity issue can't be ignored either, since losing 10 new monsters compared to Iceborne is just too big of a drop for me. This becomes especially apparent in the endgame, which feels just a tad bit sparse, particularly after going through the excellent campaign experience. Yeah, the campaign itself I really like. It's one of the best campaigns I've gone through, as far as Monster Hunter. I mean, the story's not like War and Peace or anything, but Monster Hunter has really never been about story, although they did try with World and Iceborne. And then in this one, the story's okay too, but I just like the overall package of the campaign, including the missions you had to do, and then the follower quest stuff. Just felt really nice. Yeah, but as far as endgame, Iceborne, for example, had the Guiding Lands, which felt like a proper new endgame activity, even though it started out a bit too grindy, and also split the player base a bit, because some people would do other missions and some would do Guiding Lands. But yeah, Guiding Lands, especially at first, was just such a grind, and then it was so hard to get just randoms in there. And they all had their own stuff to do, so I know some of my friends really liked it, but for me it was just a little bit too much. Although it did improve towards the end when they patched stuff, and it also really felt like actual endgame content, you know? And then even Rise, which gets dinged for not having enough content, at least had rampages, which did help fill out the post-game stuff, and now that's disappeared from Master Rank. Now, admittedly, Rampage mode had its share of issues, and it sounds like not a lot of people liked it, and I have a feeling that was a factor in why they decided to drop it, because I'm sure Capcom has access to stats about the game, and they're probably seeing that Rampage mode wasn't attracting as many people as they'd like. So either that, or maybe they just didn't have enough time, but despite that, I thought it was like a pretty fun mode, especially when you had at least one extra player with you, although it did have a problem when you were going solo. That was like the biggest sort of thing for me as far as Rampages. Like, doing it solo was just a bit of a pain. Well, a big pain. But it was fun when you get a group together, so I thought it could have been better with some tweaks, or maybe even just reducing the waves so they didn't take so much time. But I understand that people had issues with it, and that's fine. But at the same time, the fact that it was taken out feels like we're losing content instead of having content added, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so now the endgame is primarily dependent on anomaly quests, which pit you against tougher infected monsters, and you basically need to hunt them in order to fully upgrade your weapons. So in a sense, it's actually more of a return to classic Monster Hunter. It's almost like a nod to the old Deviant monsters, which I remember reading a lot when people were complaining about Rampage mode. And so the most common suggestion was like, hey, just bring back something like the Deviant system. And so I guess this is actually what a lot of folks asked for, so to their credit, Capcom does listen. Now, I actually think that the afflicted monsters are great, thanks to the extra challenge that they bring to the table. I mean, in addition to being immune to trapping, afflicted monsters also add extra mechanics that shake things up a bit. So this includes nerfing the healing efficacy of items like max potions, which suddenly fail to fill up your entire life bar if you happen to be hit with affliction as well. And then even minor monsters such as Tobikadachi suddenly become a threat if you're not careful. I just thought it was hilarious seeing people getting carded by, you know, Anomaly Royal Ludroth. And I say that as someone who's almost died many times to these minor monsters that are now like afflicted. I do hope that the gear from the DLC stuff does not get overbalanced to the point where it becomes easy to hunt these minor monsters as well. Because I really like seeing minor monsters get super powerful. It's almost a shame when you get good gear and they become stepping stones instead, but I've always enjoyed the first time you hunt them when your gear is pretty bad, because then you appreciate stuff like Tobikadachi, and even Arzuros. So yeah, keep the minor anomaly monsters dangerous. In fact, about my only gripe is that I wish they had their own unique armor set at least. I mean, right now they only provide afflicted materials for upgrading weapons, which is not bad, but it also would have been nice to see some armor diversity, especially given how Blade Master and Gunner armor are now essentially the same in terms of looks. I mean, in the old games we got Blade Master and Gunner armor that's separate, and then in World and Iceborne, even though Blade Master and Gunner could share the same armor, you at least had like alpha and beta versions too, so it would have been nice to get some armor diversity. Although I've heard that they're doing an update as far as the anomaly stuff, where you could now get items for upgrading armor, and it looks like it might have an RNG component to it too, so I guess that might add stuff to do for endgame as well. I mean, honestly, Sunbreak's endgame right now is great for folks like me who have limited time and can't pour in the insane amount of hours required by, say, a Guiding Lands. But I know that others might feel differently, especially people with a lot of time or, people who just play this game primarily. So I get that. But yeah, the absence of some features just makes it feel like stuff was taken out of the game. And it's never good to feel like you're getting less than what you got before, Even though technically we're getting some additional stuff with anomaly quests. I mean, come to think of it, Sunbreak doesn't even have a proper siege mission against a large monster like in past games. And so with the emphasis on castle ruins in the trailers, I thought it would add a new one for sure, because these look like an ideal siege location. And then, given the positive reaction to the jungle, I could only imagine how much the community would have reacted if they brought back, say, the classic Jen Moran hunt on the Sea of Sand. Granted, siege missions can be hit or miss, and also suffer from the same issue some players have with rampage quests taking too long. But they can be fun when done right, and they're also part of the classic Monster Hunter experience, so it's kind of sad to see that not happen here. Maybe for future DLC, we'll see. I mean, I have a feeling the pandemic might have something to do with it again. So here's hoping that the post-game support and free DLC from Capcom is on point, and is basically more akin to Iceborne than it was for Rise, which felt a bit lacking. Now, while the lower monster count at launch is an issue, the other component of Monster Hunter's 1-2 punch remains pretty stellar, thankfully, and I'm talking about the gameplay. Gameplay is the big reason why I rated Rise favorably, despite its more apparent flaws compared to past games, and it's also the reason why I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Sunbreak as well. Now, I know some old school purists might disagree, but this is as good as the overall gameplay has felt for me, at least, in the history of the franchise, from a combat standpoint. I mean, I just felt that was really excellent. Although that's just my opinion, of course. I mean, yes, there will be debates when it comes to weapon tuning, as well as buffs and nerfs for people's weapons of choice or existing skills. But as far as the base mechanics go, I just absolutely love it. Rise's mechanics are actually a big reason why I haven't gone back to Iceborne, and I consider Iceborne to arguably be the best game in the series, after having Monster Hunter 4U hold that top spot for me in my personal rankings. And I say that as far as the enjoyment I got in terms of playing the game for the first time. So it's just hard to return to Iceborne's greatsword gameplay, for example, after experiencing the improvements for the weapons in Rise. And then on top of that, Sunbreak also further builds on the gameplay established by Rise with even more new skills and mechanics. Strong Arm Stance is just so good. I love Strong Arm Stance. Speaking of new additions, I'm a huge fan of the new follower quests that let you play with NPC characters. This is arguably the biggest change in the franchise for solo players, since player count scaling was introduced by World. I was actually surprised with how competent the AI was as an ally. I mean, they're really good. I thought I was just going to be babysitting them the whole time, but there were actually times when they literally saved me, so kudos to Capcom for that. They would actually do moves that some actual hunters sometimes have a hard time pulling off, and so I thought that was pretty impressive. The followers also have different personalities, with some leaning more towards support, while others focus more on attacking. This means you can pick a follower based on your playstyle or your needs. My favorite is the healing-averse Luchika, equipped with a bowgun. I mean, she's just so good, especially with the stickies and all the other stuff, and then her personality is just hilarious. It's like totally changes from when she's in the hub and then when she's out there. It's like, she's all disappointed before you meet up the monster, because it's like, oh, where's the monster? And then when she finds the monster, it's just like, found you. And then she just totally changes. Plus, as the only one who uses the bowgun in my group, I mean, I use different weapons, but as far as bowgunning, I'm the only one who does it. And so people like playing with me when I'm gunning, but I kind of miss playing with other gunners because nobody in my group does. And so it feels nice to be able to pair up with another gunner, especially when I'm using a melee weapon. Even though that gunner is just like, an AI companion. In fact, my only complaint is that you can't bring followers with you on regular quests. Yeah, so having to do follower quests solo can also be a drag on multiplayer sessions with friends, because you essentially have to leave them in order to do your follower quests, so it would have been nice if it was integrated into the co-op experience as well. Still, just having someone like Fiorrain with you for certain story quests is a great feature. It also fixes one of the main gripes I have about the series, and people who play with me know this really well. In fact, my niece still remembers the first time I did the last boss for World, and then the Admiral, and then the Seeker, I believe that Wyverian was also there. And I was telling her, just you wait, these two look like they're helping me now. They're gonna bail out the moment the monster's out. Just something's gonna happen. And then something did, and they just left. And so my niece was just cackling the whole time. It's like, they left you, like you said. Now in contrast, Fiorrain actually carries her own weight, and even gets her time to shine by a cool cutscene during the fight against the last boss. And then Palawus also get extra use thanks to some new abilities. This includes providing extra storage, as well as a new Sniff 'em Out ability that makes it easier to find marked items on the map, whether it be materials or endemic life. Palicos, meanwhile, can now have the moves in 3 of their 5 skill slots edited, making it easier to have that quote-unquote perfect Palico finally. They also get new secret support skills, kind of like double secret probation, I guess, which includes a healing bat, explosive fireworks, and my favorite, a lucky lottery box that can knock down monsters with a mini Dragonator that's appropriately called the Kidinator. In fact, I slap it onto almost every Palico that I bring with me. And then for hunters, the ability to have 2 different loadouts of switch skills out in the field is a game changer as well. Not just from a quality of life standpoint, but also by allowing you to use 2 different moves that you couldn't bring together before. And so this is especially true for certain weapons like Greatsword and Longsword, which benefit greatly from being able to bring 2 different loadouts. And by that I mean Rage Slash and True Charge Slash, for example. Before you had to pick one over the other, and now you can bring them both. It's like having your cake and eating it too. And then some of the new switch skills added to Sunbreak are also quite fun. As an example, this includes a new Surge combo for Greatsword that trades away the ability to tackle more frequently, and also charge mid-combo, but in exchange you get faster strikes and a higher chance of staggering monsters. And then the new Strong Arm stance that I talked about earlier is also a game changer. It's pretty much a true counter, as opposed to just being a guard point, and so it pretty much shores up one of the holes in the Greatsword's repertoire. In addition to providing for more technical play, it also gives new life to moves like True Charge Slash, which you can now hit more easily than before, whereas before it felt like you were gambling sometimes when you use it. And then Heavy Bowgun sees the return of Crouching Fire, which has great synergy with the new switch skills that allow you to create a special ring for improving bullet performance as they pass through it. And for Insect Glaive, you also get a nice alternative to the helicopter move via the new Kinsect Slash. And this one doubles as an attack and also as an essence grabber at the same time, and it's also pretty powerful, so it feels very satisfying when you land it consecutively on a monster's head, and either break parts or cause the monster to topple. Even the seemingly simple decision to reduce the Warbug requirement for the Lance's Twin Vine skill actually makes a difference in improving that weapon. Now, not all the new moves are groundbreaking, of course, but they do help improve Ryze's already great mechanics even more. And then while the game also added a bunch of quality of life features, there are a few more that would have helped improve the user experience, I think. For example, my coworker, Munishiro, who helped me review the game, has a pet peeve with the skill search function for armor, which I actually agree with, since I have the same problem. So basically, since World, I believe, that feature shows results in a non-standard order, that can be hard to navigate. It would be much better if it showed results in alphabetical order, or at least gave you the option to, which would help streamline the process for players who like to build mixed set armors, for example. The same can be said for the search function for decorations, which could also use some improvement in order to make it easier to find the one that you want, at least based on the skill that you're looking for. Now, admittedly, Ryze's gameplay, and by extension Sunbreak's, has been a bit polarizing for certain pockets of the community. This is particularly true for some longtime players who prefer classic Monster Hunter's more grounded gameplay, for example. In fact, the coworker I mentioned, who's been playing since the very first Monster Hunter game, pretty much has this exact same issue with Ryze and Sunbreak, because he basically feels that they're a bit too freewheeling. Now, it's a complaint I can certainly understand, as someone who took my licks as I went through the pain of mastering the series' more difficult classic gameplay, even though I actually happen to like many of the changes that some players are critical about now. In fact, I still remember when some people in the community complained about Generation Ultimate's addition of Hunter Arts, and basically refused to play the game because of that. And I consider Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate to be the last classic Monster Hunter entry. I do feel though that when people say Ryze and Sunbreak feel easier, it's probably because of all the things that hunters are now allowed to do, and not because the monsters got weaker. It's the same thing when people were complaining that World felt easier. It's not that the monsters got easier. If anything, the monsters felt stronger overall. It's just that the quality of life improvements, which are especially noticeable for weapons like bowguns, for example. I mean, just the camera improvement is a huge deal. So anyway, yeah, those changes made fighting the monsters easier, especially when you factor in all the extra tools at your disposal, such as being able to heal while moving, for example. Although I feel that in this game especially, they kind of factor that into the equation, because monsters are just so good at tracking that even the ability to move while healing isn't enough sometimes. I mean, a lot of times I actually just mount my Palamute, and then I run around and heal. And even when I do that, they can still track me sometimes. It's just crazy how better the monsters have gotten in terms of just homing in on you. And then with Sunbreak, you get even more help. So not only do you have the mechanics like Blastodes and Sleep Toads from World, and then Puppet Spiders and Wyvern Riding from Ryze, you now also have Marionette Spiders, which essentially give you a free monster topple, if you do it right. And just like I mentioned earlier, just the Warbug Wirefall recovery alone makes a huge difference in impacting the difficulty of the game. It pretty much reduces the chances of you being wombo comboed. unless you do it at the wrong time, because you can get hit while you're recovering. So sometimes it's actually good to kind of lie down for a bit, and then wait for the monster to go through you, and then you wirebug full recover. Or wirefall recover. Yeah, so it's basically just like war, where you now have offensive weapons outpacing the available defensive options. So military tanks, for example, are better than ever today. But then you now have these tools like man-pads, which pretty much wreck them. I mean, heck, I remember when some people complained about the introduction of mounting in the game's 4th generation, and how that made the game easier. And so as someone who actually doesn't like to use traps, for example, as a way to keep monsters in place so I can just wail on them and then just spam traps, I can kind of understand where they're coming from. Although me personally, I actually love the addition of the mounting mechanic, especially when I became an Insect Glaive main for Monster Hunter 4. Yeah, I just thought it was a nice addition overall. And then personally, I actually like the wirebug moves too, and I especially like the extra nimbleness that they give traditionally slow weapons such as Greatsword, which has been my main weapon for Rise, and then Heavy Bowgun, which was one of my main weapons in Tri and Iceborne. So I don't think it's necessarily game-breaking. I mean, it's a nice option as far as mobility to get away when you need to. But a lot of times I also use it for extra aggression, so I can stick to the monster constantly. Not just to pull away. And that helps, especially with slower weapons. I also consider wirebugs as kind of their own unique thing associated with Rise. Just like Hunter Arts eventually ended up being a unique feature for Monster Hunter generations. So for folks who are maybe new to the series, Monster Hunter traditionally had 2 development approaches, with one adopting the more experimental approach seen in games such as Generations and then now Rise. And so I have a feeling that the next mainline Monster Hunter game for PlayStation from the main team is not going to be quite as freewheeling as Rise and Sunbreak is, so I'm basically just enjoying these games for what they are. These are also the times when having the perspective of a longtime fan actually helps. So I remember fans criticizing Tri for not being as good, quote-unquote, as the 2nd generation of Monster Hunter, which I actually feel is only valid in terms of monster count, because the hitbox improvements in Tri alone was a big and welcome change. Because prior to Tri, hitboxes can be pretty wonky, especially some of those hip checks from a certain fish monster. Ah, Plessy. Don't ever change. Actually, please change. We don't want old broken hitbox Plessy. Yeah, and then there was also underwater combat, which was a love it or hate it deal, because it could be unwieldy, but boy, fighting Lagacruz and even Royal Ludroth in the water is a totally different experience. They're just kind of nerfed when it comes to land. I think that's why they ended up making White Lagacruz, which was more tailored for land combat, because normal Lagacruz was a lot more dangerous in the water, and a lot more epic. Like you're down in the dark depths, you know, and then you see just this lightning and his eyes, or its eyes, just light up. It was a totally different experience. I'm hoping that they bring back underwater hunting, like in the next mainline game for PlayStation. Because it certainly can handle it now, and maybe they'll have enough improvements to make it better. Like the camera was the main thing that was bad about it, but boy, it really made you think. And then as a gunner, I was a gunner main at that time. I also had to be closer, because the water kind of halves the effective distance of your shots. And boy, that was a butt-clenching experience. Yeah, so Laggy, Royal Ludroth, and even a freaking Gobel, especially in the narrow swamp waters. Oh my gosh, what an experience. Anyway, yeah, I remember people criticizing Tri for not being as good as the 2nd generation. And then I remember people criticizing Generations for Hunter Arts. And then after that, people were criticizing World for not being as good as Generations Ultimate. Yeah, and then folks criticize Rise in comparison to World. And then now I see some players criticizing Sunbreak and comparing it to Iceborne. And not even base Iceborne, but they compare it to like Iceborne after all the updates. Which is kind of funny too, because I remember the criticisms for World, and to some extent Iceborne. And so seeing people now say that Iceborne was the best ever, it's kind of funny in a sense, because I mean, I do agree. Like, I consider Iceborne to be the best iteration. Although some old school people might disagree on that. But yeah, so this happens all the time when a new Monster Hunter game comes out. Now, I will be the first to admit that some of those criticisms are actually valid. I mean, not just valid, but quite valid. And in fact, I voiced several of my own criticisms about Sunbreak in this review. At the same time, there's always going to be a set of players within the community who will criticize every new game compared to the one that just came before it. I mean, I do think criticism is fine, and I say that as a reporter in my real-world job. And so, you know, criticism is fine and actually needed, in my opinion, because that's how you fix issues and make the next game better, or even improve on the current game via patches. Having said that, criticisms also must be legitimate. So it can't be criticism just for the sake of criticism, or maybe self-validation of yourself or your opinions to the exclusion of others' own experiences. Otherwise, it's just like how some older folks automatically criticizing the younger generation. And I'm starting to get older, so I don't want to be like that. I purposefully think about that because I already have friends who are starting to criticize younger people for not knowing what they're doing, which can be true in some cases, but it's not like a blanket thing, right? Because, when you do that, that's more for self-affirmation, and it really doesn't accomplish anything. At least nothing productive, except making yourself feel better sometimes. So World definitely brought in a lot of people, a lot more people, to the franchise, so that's something that comes with its own list of pros and cons. So on one hand, it's nice to see more mainstream gamers enjoying Monster Hunter and finally getting it, like we've been getting it for all this time, in our heads. It's like, why do you like playing that game? I go, you just gotta try it. Just try it. And so having more people playing it is actually good. Because I've always wondered, oh no, Monster Hunter's not selling in the West. What if they cancel it once it starts not selling in Japan too? Especially given the move to like mobile gaming in Japan, which is one of the more crushing disappointments I've seen in my life as someone who played a lot of Japanese games growing up. Yeah, so the added support was great for me because it provides extra reassurance about the future of the franchise. And that last part is especially important because it also explains the reason behind all the changes that were made for World. Because as sad as it may sound, ultimately Capcom is a business that wants to sell more games. I mean, it's great that the Monster Hunter team is really passionate about Monster Hunter, and you could see that all the way to the top. But ultimately, they want more players to be playing this game. And so some players might complain about how those changes quote-unquote ruin the franchise. But one thing that is undeniable and is not opinion, is that those changes made World a global success. Something that the franchise has failed to achieve with its classic formula. A formula that I love, but yeah, it's been pretty much a niche series until they made the changes. Although some may say it's, the return of PlayStation might have helped. They could still keep it like, classic, but I know a lot of people, I tried to get into Monster Hunter, who quit just because of like the healing flicks. It's like, what is this? What's the point of this? I'm like, well, the point is so you don't spam healing and you think about it more and like, oh, I don't want to do that. I'm like, okay, yeah. Yeah, so if you look at the sales numbers alone, then these are apparently changes that people want. I mean, it made Monster Hunter like the #1 Capcom IP. In a history of great IPs like Resident Evil and all that stuff. Yeah, so changes to make the game more accessible and attract a larger audience also mean that a lot of the quirks of past Monster Hunter games that old school fans consider a rite of passage have also gone by the wayside. I mean, yeah, I still remember how much more skilled you needed to be as a gunner, for example, which was my main weapon at the beginning of my Monster Hunter journey, largely because of the less player-friendly camera system. I mean, I was so happy when they added that fake lock-on, the target camera, because that made a huge difference as a gunner. And then I also remember when solo speedruns were also much more challenging due to the fact that there was no player scaling for hub quests, which meant solo players had to beat content scaled for multiplayer. Yeah, and so I remember the solo speedruns back then being extra impressive. All that being said, I also don't want to end up as some Monster Hunter boomer who delegitimizes the experience of newer players. I mean, yeah, obviously a larger audience can magnify issues such as toxicity, but at the same time, a lot of newer players have also added to the community, which you can see with some of the content creators who came after the release of World. Yeah, so I think that has been good too. I mean, bad for me personally, because now I have to compete with all other content compared to before. Like pre-World, my written guides at least did so well, did really, really well. And now I have to compete with all the media outlets that are covering it en masse now. So, I mean, it still does okay, but it doesn't do the same numbers I used to make before World. And that's fine, because now there's more information out there for the community. Although there's also a lot more bad information out there too. Or like, fluff guides that are kind of clickbait, but really don't say anything. And I make it a point not to use clickbait in my headlines, which actually harms me because clickbait unfortunately does work. But, just as a journalist, I don't like using clickbait. I mean, that's fine if you're just a content creator, because that's your livelihood and, that's what you need to do to get a leg up. But I kind of just do this for fun, so I don't need to use clickbait. Anyway, what am I talking about? This has gotten super long. Yeah, so ultimately, I think both old and new Monster Hunter are part of the Monster Hunter experience. I just consider myself lucky to be part of that early wave, because it made me appreciate the franchise fully and see it grow to what it is today. Yeah, I mean, it's sad to lose some of the things that defined the core experience of Monster Hunter back then. At the same time, I'm also happy to see the franchise thriving today. Since I have the experience of those classic games, it's easier for me to actually go back if I find myself having a craving for that classic Monster Hunter experience, which does happen from time to time. And so I can always fire up those old games to scratch that itch. That is part of the privilege of being a veteran of the series, as it allows me to appreciate both the old and new Monster Hunter. Having said that, while I am happy with the game overall, and I mean Sunbreak, I do hope that the update schedule is more fleshed out than it was for Rise. I mean, I remember I was doing Monster Hunter Stories 2 videos, and I could see comments from some people saying, "My gosh, Monster Hunter Stories 2 is getting better post-release updates than Rise," which was true in a sense. On the plus side, it looks like they are adding at least new armor options via anomaly monsters in a later patch, so I consider that a step in the right direction. I certainly also hope that some of the issues or perceived shortcomings of the game also get addressed, and that Sunbreak gets the same attention that Iceborne did. And by that, I mean attention that's befitting of a mainline game in the series, so Sunbreak doesn't feel like Iceborne's red-headed stepchild, or a stopgap before the next PlayStation entry. I think fans who supported Rise and Sunbreak deserve that at the very least. And also, please bring back Prowler mode. Pretty please? I mean, the cats are so good now, and I could only imagine how good Prowler mode could be if it came back. But maybe that's for the next Monster Hunter, who knows. Anyway, this has been longer than expected, so thank you for listening all the way through if you're still here. As always, if you have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. Once again, this is Tabiasobi, and thank you for watching.
どうです？私も頑張ってみましたよ。なかなか充実した時間でした。